Well, we're continuing with our sermon series today called Suitcase. We're talking about baggage. And the reason that we're going over this is because all of us who are in Christ Jesus have entered into a covenant relationship with Him. And we talked a couple of sermon series ago about covenants and all that they mean. And then we talked about the idea that a lot of times we don't find ourselves very happy in covenants. And so we talked about the issues involved in being happy in our covenant with Jesus. Now what we're going to be talking about through this series is the fact that when we enter into a covenant, we bring a lot of baggage with us from previous covenants, and those get in the way of our relationship with Christ. And so today we're going to be talking about possessions. And possessions are one of those things that can easily trip us up in our relationship with Christ. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 13 today, starting in verse 5. So if you'd like to turn there, we'll be there in just a minute. As we get into this, it's important to understand that, our view of possessions is shaped from the time that we're young, and it's shaped by our culture, it's shaped by a lot of things. But being in a covenant relationship with Christ means that we let His Word shape our view of possessions. And so that's really the key here, is as we talk about materialism, as we talk about our relationship to possessions, that we let our relationship with Christ inform us of how we should interact with those things. So Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 says, "Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear, what can man do to me?" Now, it's an interesting passage because it doesn't say just, don't become materialistic. It doesn't say just don't value your possessions so highly. It says something very fascinating. It says that you shouldn't develop a love of money. You should be content with what you have. Why? Because of your relationship with Christ. Really what this passage is showing us is that our relationship with Christ and our relationship with possessions can very easily become pitted against one another. And to love and value too highly the one is going to reflect in a lesser value of the other. We want to answer three questions as we approach this text today. And the first one is, what place should possessions have in our lives? Secondly, we want to ask, what is the danger of possessions? And lastly, how do I transform my relationship with possessions? What are all the things that we need to learn here about the place of possessions, the danger of possessions, and finally, transforming your relationship with possessions? So first of all, what's the place that possessions should have in our lives? So the thing is, the question always is, well, do I just take a vow of poverty then and give everything up? Is that what I should be doing? And the answer to this is actually more complex and actually goes back much further than often we would like to admit. The interesting thing about Christianity is, unlike some other religions, Christianity does not see the material world as inherently and intrinsically evil. The material world is not evil in and of itself. We're not in a dualistic philosophy or religion where we see the spiritual as nothing but good and the physical as nothing but bad. That's not the way the Bible describes it. And in fact, care for and concern for God's creation is part of our calling in the very beginning when we're made as people. When God created Adam and Eve in the garden, part of the calling that He gave them was to care for the creation that He had made. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, it says something important. It says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." So the problem is not in and of itself just possessions. It's not just money. It's not just those things. It's the love of those things. Now, when we're talking about the love of those things, what do we mean? Now, some people will say, I love my new dresser. I love my new dishes. Is that what we're talking about? When we say that we love these things, then that's somehow we're headed for a fall. Well, that's not exactly what it's referring to. To really drill down to this, we have to go back to the curse that God gave in the garden. And there's this problem that the curse brings out. Remember that in the garden, our trust and submission to God just kind of flew out the window. We trusted in God and all the things that he had given us, but Satan caused us to question that trust in God, and that led to the fall. And there was a curse that was put on the world of labor, that we were going to have to eat of the earth, eat through the sweat of our brow. There's this curse that's placed on our interaction with the world, that it's not going to provide us a free and easy meal as it did in the garden. And so the interesting thing about the curse is it lays out something fascinating that all of you know. You are all aware of this, and yet when I say it, you're going to wonder if it's true, and then immediately you're going to think, yes, it is. That's what's going to happen right now, right? Because this is the thing that we all know. The physical world, the purpose of the material world is to frustrate us. The purpose of the physical world is to frustrate us. Now, immediately you thought probably two things. Well, not exactly, well, yeah, right? Because it sounds bad to say, but then when you think about your experience, you think, well, that's kind of true. The physical world is constantly frustrating us. Try to do anything. You watch it, you'll see it on Pinterest, right? You'll see some project on Pinterest and you'll say, I can do that. And then it doesn't come out anything like what you saw in Pinterest. You'll see, if you're a guy, something in your house breaks and you say, well, I don't want to pay for somebody to fix this. And so you'll look up on YouTube a video about how to do it. And it does not go nearly as well for you as it did for them on YouTube. The physical world is here to frustrate you. Now, this actually isn't a bug as far as God's concerned, it's a feature. This is a feature of the natural world, and it's a feature that God put in place. It's part of the curse. When God says by the sweat of your brow, what he's going to say, what he's really saying in our type of language is, the world is here to frustrate you. Now, the immediate question is, why would God do this to us? Why would a loving God do this to us? And there are times when you ask yourself that, when you're in your garage and you're drenched with sweat and you've exhausted every one of your admittedly limited skills. You've exhausted every one of them, and the problem is worse than it was when you started. Can I get an amen? And you say, why would a loving God do this to me? Well, there's actually a good answer to that. And the answer to that is a passage that we're very familiar with. The Lord disciplines those he loves. God's doing this to you because he loves you. And it seems very strange for me to say that, but that's exactly why. God does this to you because he loves you. Now, hopefully you know from the things that I've said in the past that I am not here preaching at you. This is me too. I feel that frustration. I deal with those things, and I'm the kind of cheapskate person that will always look to do something himself and will always look for a video on how to do it and will then find himself frustrated when he attempts it. That's the life that I live. The Lord disciplines those he loves. Now, here's the thing. We have to remember back into the garden. In the garden, there was no frustration here. God had made the garden, and he made it perfect. Now, the rest of the world was good, but it was incomplete and unfinished. But in the garden, God created his specific order for things, and he put a wall around it. And that's where Adam and Eve lived. Now, they had a job to maintain that perfection, to work it and to keep it, to protect and maintain that. But they didn't have to do anything else. And in fact, they could walk up and just take food off of trees. And when they sinned against God, remember that he put an angel there at the entrance to the garden with a flaming sword to keep them from getting back to that place where they could have all those things so easily. In fact, this part of the story is so important that God, when he has Israel make the tabernacle, he has them make in the curtains that go to the Holy of Holies, the place where God dwells, the place where you could say you're back in the garden. He has them embroider on those curtains 2 cherubim. Because the idea is that the way back to the garden is blocked. You can't get back in. Why would God do this? Because he loves us. And part of his love means that he's willing to humble us if humility is the path forward for us. If pride is getting in our way, then God will humble us. And the whole world does this to us. We have these grand schemes, these grand plans of how to make the world better, of all these things, and we get constantly frustrated. The way back into the garden is constantly blocked. The world is just so much more complicated than we realize. It's so much more difficult to do the things that we want to do. Do you guys remember when you were younger, when you were kids, that you were told, magazines, news, sometimes news shows, whatever, you were told that flying cars were just around the corner? How many of you guys remember that? Flying cars are just around the corner. Any minute now, we're going to have flying cars. And there are all those cartoons. And you thought, now here's the interesting thing. Flying cars have been around the corner for like 70 years. For 70 years, they're just around the corner. And many of you might not know this. Some of you might. We actually had a person who attended our congregation a number of years ago whose father was in the 70s, the early 70s, was in a part of a major project of building a flying car that would be marketed and sold through Ford dealerships. That was the plan. Unfortunately, his father was actually killed in one of the test flights of these cars. And he grew up without a dad because the world is actually much more difficult and much more complicated than it seems like it should be. And the issue that we have to really struggle with is that God does this out of love, and it doesn't seem like that could be possible. So how do you understand the purpose of the physical world? God created an unfinished world, and we take dominion over it and perfect it. We manifest God, and we come to know and understand him. And the issue is important for us to grasp that God actually humbles us in this process for a reason. And the reason is actually not that hard to understand. In fact, once I start talking about it, it will be so obvious to you that you'll wonder how it is that I'm the one up here preaching. So let's go to point number 2. What's the danger? What is the danger of possessions? Where do we find the danger here? Because if you have possessions, and you do, you don't see them obviously. Well, some of them might be dangerous, but there's an overall danger here. And once again, to understand this, we have to go back to the garden. We have to look at this problem of Adam and Eve being naked and the fact that they tried to solve them with fig leaves. You guys remember that? Adam and Eve, when they ate from the tree of the garden, they realized that they were naked, and immediately they thought, we have to do something about this, and so they covered themselves with fig leaves. Now, the issue that we have to look at is, as we all know, that this isn't a sexual thing. It's about inadequacy. It's about the fact that they are inadequate people, that when they had a relationship with God, their inadequacy wasn't much of a problem because he was much more than sufficient for their inadequacy. But now that they don't trust him anymore, their inadequacy is a really big issue. And covering it over with fig leaves, this problem is not helpful. They don't kill an animal. God does that, and that's how he solves their problem. They try to use fig leaves. He kills an animal. There's a big difference between these two things. And really what we're getting at here, there's always a difference between the boss and his idiot son. You guys know what I'm talking about? You can see this all the time in the world. You have some guy who built up a business. He built up a business. He worked really hard. He built up a business, and he's been very successful, and he's had to work and strive and struggle and deal with the world and all the frustrations, constantly having to overcome those frustrations. And the problem is that most of the time, this doesn't happen every time, but most of the time, when his son gets handed all of the fruit of the father's labor, because he didn't have to struggle to achieve it, he doesn't know what he doesn't know. You guys know what I'm talking about? He doesn't know what he doesn't know. What happens is that the boss struggled and worked, and then in the struggle and the work, there's a humbling process, there's a sharpening process, there's a maturing process. But in having all of that, the fruit of all that handed to you, you didn't have to go through any of those things. And so the way back to the garden is blocked because without our own struggle, we become just like the boss's idiot sons. That's what happens to us. Without that constant engagement with the world, without that constant humbling process that we go through, what happens is when we just get everything that we want, without that struggle, it becomes not life to us, but it becomes death instead. I was listening to a guy who was talking about how a house isn't really your house until you've remodeled it. A house isn't really your house until you've remodeled it. And you know what I mean by that, right? The thing is that whether it's painting or doing the roof or whatever it is, you can buy a house that somebody else built, but you're just living in it because you don't understand it. You haven't struggled over it. You haven't sweat over it. You haven't fallen off a ladder onto the ground while you're trying to fix it. You haven't cut yourself while you're trying to cut a wire or something. You haven't bled into that house. It's not really yours yet. But the issue is that once you start doing those things, and it doesn't matter whether it's something simple like painting or whatever, it starts to become yours. Why? Because you gain an understanding of what that house is. What happens when we struggle with the world is we start to understand the world. And as we start to understand the world, we start to understand the creator of the world. And really this is why the humbling process is so important. Because without that humbling process, we have a tendency to see him and us kind of on the same level. You know, that's what Adam and Eve were striving for, and that's what they thought they could achieve when they decided not to trust in him, but to eat the fruit instead. Remember what Satan says? He says, you will become like God. But the reality of the situation, and in order to have a proper relationship with God, you have to be you, and God has to be God. You have to be you. And God has to be God. Here's the thing. How do you trust in God if you feel like you're kind of at his same level? How is it helpful to have a God in heaven who loves you if really he's just another version of you? Right? How do you go through life saying, I'm going to trust in God, I'm going to trust, if all you have is somebody who just is a reflection of who you are? You see, what happens is that whole anxiety of inadequacy is created in Adam and Eve when they start to see God as being like them. When they lower God to their level, when they question his motives and they say, well, that's what I would do, so that's probably what God is doing here too. When they say, I want to be like God, all of that is really a lowering of God. And how can you not exist in this world in complete anxiety if all there is in heaven is just another version of you? You can't get it together here on earth. What good would it be to have another you somewhere else? It's not any good at all. The fascinating thing is that God has a glory cloud, and we have a glory cloud as well. If ever you read about God in his throne room in the Old Testament, almost always there's this picture of the fact that God, when he's in his throne room, there is a cloud around him. And we've talked about that cloud a number of times. It both reveals God and conceals him. It reveals him because the cloud actually reflects his glory and his radiance, but it also conceals him because you see the cloud and not necessarily him. The thing that we really need to grapple with is the fact that we all have glory clouds as well. All of us do. Every one of you out here has a glory cloud. And that glory cloud consists of both physical things and spiritual things. That glory cloud is a reflection of who you are. Now, the problem is that you can go after a fig leaf of a glory cloud, or you can go after the real thing. Just like Adam and Eve in the garden, they put on a fig leaf, and God said, no, that's not adequate. You have to kill an animal, and then you can cover yourself. Just like they went after the reproduction, we can do the same thing here, and we do a lot, and that's what physical possessions can become for you. Physical possessions can become a fig leaf in your life, and that's the danger of them. Because you can start saying to yourself, well, look at all that I have. Look at all that I have. I have so many houses, and they are so amazing. I have so many cars. Look at how they are. I have so many accomplishments. I have so many accolades. I have so many trophies. I have so many signs of how great I am. And you can look at your clothes, and you can look at everything, and the problem is that you can become like the boss's idiot son who has been handed all of these things and hasn't had to struggle in the world and been humbled by them. You see, the issue is funny to think about in a sense, because the same thing that can humble you can also cause you to be very proud. You can look at all of the things around you physically, and you can love them because they cover up your inadequacy. Or you can look at the world around you, and by trying to struggle with it, you can start being humbled by it and realize that you need something much greater than that. I was reminded of this. I was watching a video this last week of some Taliban guys were going into the palace of a guy that was a commander in the Afghan National Army. And this palace was just unbelievable. And I started thinking about the fact that it seems like in the Middle East, if you're anybody, you have to have a palace. And then, if you're really somebody, then you have to have a whole bunch of palaces. If you're a guy like Saddam Hussein, do you guys remember Saddam Hussein had palaces everywhere. They were just everywhere that he went. He had a palace in every province. He had maybe multiple palaces in big cities. Everywhere he went, he had palaces. And the question is, why the palace? Why the cause? How many palaces do you need? Why? Do you guys remember pictures of American soldiers going in and like taking over palaces and just hanging out? They're all dirty and everything, and they're sitting in these big chairs and chandeliers over them. Do you guys remember those pictures? How many palaces would you need if you were the leader of a country? And what is one more palace? Have you thought about why they need them? They're a fig leaf, right? These palaces are a fig leaf. They become something that's a substitute for real glory. They become something that's a substitute for real glory. And the interesting thing is, the worse these people are, the bigger the tyrants these people are, the more palaces they seem to need. It's almost like there's a connection. It's almost like there's a connection between how terrible they are and how many palaces they need. They become a fig leaf. They become a way of trying to show themselves and the rest of the world, no, I'm a great person, I'm a great person. Meanwhile, they're murdering people, throwing people into prison for no reason. You know what I'm saying? That's what they're doing. And the question is, well, then what's real glory? Possessions can become a way of saying, I am so great, everything is so easy for me, I am so amazing. But in reality, they're actually a lie. They're actually a lie. And what they do is they create independence from God instead of dependence upon Him. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 7 through 9 says, 2 things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of the Lord. That's actually an interesting and perceptive desire. It's a very perceptive desire, right? Don't make me too rich because then I will say, I don't need you, God. Don't make me too poor because then I might do something that profanes your name. Possessions, the problem with them, the love of them, is the tendency we have to take possessions and turn them into a fig leaf, which is just a lie. Something that is a pretense toward glory, but in reality, there is none. So lastly, how do I transform my relationship with possessions? Now, here's the thing that we have to grasp and get a hold of. How do I transform my relationship? How do I keep, because we have to have possessions in order to live, how do I keep them from becoming something that they shouldn't? How do I keep them from becoming a fig leaf in my life? Well, the biggest thing that we have to learn in relationship to this is we have to learn how to give. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 through 7, it says, the point is this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. How do you turn possessions from a fig leaf into something that represents more true glory? Because remember, it's not possessions and it's not money that's the problem, it's the love of them. Well, you have to understand that the reason that we develop a love for possessions is because they cover over our inadequacy and they make us feel glorious. But like we said, that's a fig leaf. Well, how do you get rid of that? How do you stop doing that? How do you keep them from being that fig leaf? Well, you do what God did in the garden. Remember that God killed an animal, and that was the clothing that they wore. That was the true covering of their inadequacy. So what's the difference here? Basically, glory does not come from the abundance of your possessions. Glory doesn't come from the abundance of your possessions. True glory, real glory, godly glory comes from your willingness to die. You understand, right? Glory, true glory, real glory is not from how many palaces you have and how many people you killed to get them. Real, true glory comes from your willingness to die. That's why the dead animal was the appropriate clothing and the fig leaf wasn't. There is no death in the fig leaf, but there's death in the animal. And true glory comes from our willingness to die. And you say, well, how could that be? Well, look at Jesus. What is Jesus' true glory? Jesus was the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And do we worship him because of that? Do we say, well, Jesus had more palaces than your guy did? Jesus had more palaces. Your guy has 15 palaces. Jesus has 17 and a half. Clearly, our God is more glorious because your God's amplifier goes to 10 and our God's goes to 11. If you didn't get that joke, I apologize. Is that why we worship God? Is that, it's interesting that Paul talks about the fact that the cross is foolishness and stumbling blocks to people who don't grasp it. The idea of a God who dies is just so crazy to so many people, and yet that's where the glory is. It doesn't matter how, at what point does it get just stupid to keep counting things? I don't know if you guys, I was reading that over COVID, that the 10 richest people in the world added, do you guys know how much wealth they added over COVID? 10 richest people, 10. They added $500 billion in wealth to their fortunes over COVID. At what point does it just get stupid to keep track? At what point does another billion going to make a difference? At what point, is that what we're arguing about here? Is that our God is richer than these guys? That our God is richer, our God is greater, our God is bigger? Your God is 150 feet tall, ours is 152. Is that what we're arguing about? No, that's not where the glory of God is. The glory of God is that he loves us so much that he was willing to die on the cross for us. The cross is the glory of God, and it's the only true covering. So if you want to take your possessions and keep them from being something that covers over your inadequacy, but turns them into actual glory, then be willing to give them up, and be willing to give them up happily for somebody who really needs them. I'm saying wants. Somebody who really is in need. Because that's what true glory is. And not only do you give them up, but you do so cheerfully, gladly. That's something that's kind of crazy. Think about Jesus and think about the fact that he did what he did for the joy set before him. That God, and I was talking about this in our earlier class, it's easy to think, when you see pictures of the Old Testament God, you see pictures of a God who's like pointing at people, like about to like light them up or something. He's pointing like you're in trouble. Like when you come home and your dog has done something bad. You know what that's the picture, but now we have God doing that, and he's got long white hair and a long white beard, and he's doing that to you. But what is the fruit of the Spirit? Anger? Joy. Do you think of the God of the Old Testament as being full of joy? And do you think that joy motivated Jesus? That when Jesus gave his life for us, that it was joy that motivated, that Jesus saw your need. Jesus saw the position that you're in. He saw your inadequacy. He saw your sin. He saw the fact that you were separated from him. He saw all those things. And for the joy set before him, he gave up everything. That's the glory of God. That's the God who we serve. And that's what makes us glorious also. Your possessions are glorious when they've taught you something, humbled you, and taught you something about the God that you serve. When you've taken on his character and are willing to give like he does. When you've seen a glimpse in your possessions of his true glory, when you look at them and you say, this is a small reflection of the glory of God, and in pursuit of trying to know these things, understand them, take care of them, take dominion over them, I've learned how difficult things really are, and it makes me marvel at the glory of God, and I will give them up as hard fought as they have been. I will give them up in a moment for somebody who needs them. That's how you transform your possession or your relationship with your possessions. It has to come from a complete trust in God that he is adequate. How do you get a complete trust in God? You allow you to become smaller and you allow God to become bigger. It's interesting that in Europe, those great cathedrals were actually made not to make you feel at home. If you've ever walked into a cathedral, if you've seen the enormous ceilings, they made those so tall as they possibly could, because they wanted you to feel small. And they wanted you to feel small to increase your trust in God. It's an interesting thing. It's the opposite of what we would think. We think, there'd be a beanbag chair there, and make it feel at home. You walk into a cathedral, you flop onto the beanbag chair, and you just, you drink whatever it is that you're drinking, and there you're at home. No, it was the opposite. They wanted you to feel tiny and kind of uncomfortable. Why? Because they wanted you to get a sense of the grandeur and the glory of God, because how else could you trust in him? And the interesting thing is the same thing can happen as you work on your car, as you work on your house. You know what? These things are made to make you feel small. The world is made to make you feel small. When you walk into the redwood forest and you see the stars up above in the middle of the night, and you think, how small I am, that can be the most terrifying experience of your life, or it can be the most fulfilling experience of your life if you realize how much bigger God is than the entire universe. You can't make God your size and trust in Him. So let the world make you feel small. Embrace it. Embrace the fact that you don't understand what you're doing. Embrace the fact that you see that thing on Pinterest and it's going to be so much harder and it's going to come out so much worse than you thought it was going to. Praise God and say, look, I can't do even this, and God can run the universe. But trusting in Him is more than just that. It means understanding your relationship to Him. Understanding your relationship to Him. In one of the lessons that I recorded this week that we put up on YouTube and Facebook, I was talking about, as we were going through the book of Matthew, I was talking about the problem that we often encounter. And this problem is that we don't really understand the nature of our relationship with God. And Jesus over and over again tried to illustrate this with parables. And one of the parables He told was of a guy who goes out at the beginning of the day and he hires a bunch of servants. He hires a bunch of servants and they come and they work in his field. And he goes out during the day, he kind of goes by the city square again. And he sees more guys standing out there. And he says, well, why are you guys standing around out here? Just come on, come work in my field. And then, day's almost over. There's only like an hour of daylight left. And he walks by the city square again and he sees more guys standing out there. And so he says, come on, come work in my vineyard. And so they all do, and at the end of the day, he settles up with them, because that's the way you did it back then. You settled up at the end of the day. And the guys that had only been working for an hour, he gave a day's wage to. And then the next group was coming in, and they thought, oh, well, these guys only worked an hour, and they got a whole day's wage. We're going to get even more. And he gave them a day's wage. And then the guys that started at the beginning of the day, they thought, well, we'll get more, surely. And he gave them a day's wage, and they were all mad. You guys remember this story? And what happened was that at the end of the day, they all came to him and they were complaining, they were grumbling. They were saying, well, you gave these guys that only worked an hour a day's wage, and you gave me the same, and I worked the full. This isn't fair. And he basically says, I'm the owner. I can be generous with people if I want. It's my money. I can do what I want. But there's an interesting thing that's happening in the context of Jesus telling this story. The context of Jesus telling the story is all about sonship. And the interesting thing is that when you become a son of God, everything that God has becomes yours. And it doesn't matter whether you become a son at the beginning of the day or the middle of the day or the end of the day. Really, it doesn't matter. Why? Because you're a son. And as a son, everything God has belongs to you. Let your possessions make you a grateful, wise, discerning son who understands the glory of God and understands that even though he might be weak and he might have these huge limitations, that everything that God has belongs to him. Become the wise and discerning son, the joyful son, the grateful son, not the idiot son. Become the son who understands, who allows the things that God has given him to turn his trust into God into something that is unbreakable, unshakable, undeniable. Let yourself get frustrated with the world. That's the job of the world. Try to learn things, try to master them, and get frustrated in the process. Let yourself be humbled so that you can see the glory of God all around you. Let your possessions turn you toward God, not away from him.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.